Hello, I hope you're having a good day today. For me, it is Tuesday. It's still morning. It's about 11 o'clock in the morning. Today, I want to talk and get started on First Amendment freedoms, and most notably, freedom of speech. I'm going to talk about three distinct elements of speech rights over the next several lectures, actually. I'm going to talk about seditious speech first. That's speech that encourages rebellion against the government. And then I'm going to talk about symbolic speech, speech that's nonverbal. We often call this freedom of expression. I'll talk about that in some length. And then we'll talk about pornography and obscenity. Pornography that is legal and obscenity that isn't, and give you a little bit of how the Supreme Court has touched on this very, very thorny issue. Now, the oldest of these three, and the one that I want to talk about in this lecture and probably the next lecture, seditious speech, speech that encourages rebellion against the government. And this really poses the fundamental question in a democratic society, and that is, what do you do with groups and what do you do with individuals whose really their sole purpose and objective is to overthrow the democratic system that gives them their very rights? The Supreme Court has traditionally been very, very split over this question. There are some justices who believe that certain groups in particular pose a clear and present danger to society, and therefore they have a right to be censored. There are other justices who say that mere membership in a group is not enough, and that instead you have to wait for individuals to engage in specific criminal conduct and then go after them with everything that you have. So in your notes, I signposted a case study that's in your book. Your book mentions this very famous 1951 Supreme Court case called Dennis versus the United States, and I'll give you a little bit more detail to this case. Mr. Dennis and about a dozen people were members of the American Communist Party. Now, these individuals had not engaged in any specific criminal conduct, no acts of terrorism or espionage or spying or anything like that. These individuals belonged to the American Communist Party. Now, that was illegal at the time. In 1940, the U.S. government passed a law called the Smith Act, which made it a crime for an individual to join any group that advocated the violent overthrow of the government. And as you can see by your notes, the Supreme Court was highly split in this particular case. The Chief Justice Vinson, led a majority. It was 5-4. And Justice Vinson, and I'm just summarizing a couple of the points that he made in this case, and this is not in your notes, but he said you don't have to wait for the revolution to start. The mere existence of the communists poses what he called the threat of substantive evil, especially at the height of the Cold War in the 1950s. And so Chief Justice Vinson and his followers said that these people should go to prison, which, of course, Mr. Dennis did. Now, the minority was led by Justice Douglas, and Justice Douglas said, and in my opinion correctly stated, that I believe you're on very dangerous grounds when you allow the government to pick and choose their enemies. In this case, Justice Douglas said the threats were always loud but puny, right? Don't allow the court to, in this case, overwhelm the First Amendment. So essentially what Douglas was saying is, look, yeah, the communists are loud, but their threats are puny. If you expose their ideas to the marketplace of ideas, people, when they scrutinize the arguments of the communists, are going to see just how weak an ideology this is, and free speech will actually destroy the communists as a party. And so That's the basic argument that we see in many of these cases involving seditious speech. There is one thought that certain groups are by their mere existence dangerous and therefore they should be allowed to be censored. The other thought is that you should not go after groups for mere membership. Instead, go after individuals when they engage in specific criminal conduct. And my bias is towards the second, although my guess is there might be exceptions to that from time to time. In your notes, I have given you 4 case studies of seditious speech. The first one never went to court. The first one, the Sedition Act of 1798, never went to court. Instead, it gets repealed by legislation, and I'll talk about this. In the 1796, we had America's first partisan election. It was a very bitter election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Adams won a very narrow victory over Jefferson, and as you might guess, we take it for granted that on a daily basis there are people who are going to be critical of the president. Certainly every day you can see editorials that are critical of President Trump. But to be fair, if you go back to President Obama, there were editorials that were critical of him every day. Well, John Adams did not take kindly to being criticized in the press. So he got his friends in Congress, and his party, the Federalists, were the majority party in both the House and the Senate. And so he got them to pass the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, which made it, quote, a crime to publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writings against the government with intent to excite against it the hatred of the people. In other words, if you write an editorial that might make the people dislike me or hate me, you could be fined or possibly even be thrown into prison. This act resulted in the conviction of 10 newspaper editors that were critical of President Adams, especially his foreign policy positions. And to me, what's interesting about this, and I think of John Adams as kind of the Richard Nixon of his time, a very brilliant man in a variety of ways. I believe, just like Richard Nixon's greatest strength was his knowledge of foreign policy and foreign affairs, I believe that this is true for John Adams as well. But like Richard Nixon, John Adams overreacted in political combat. He abused his powers to go after enemies, both real and imagined. And certainly the Alien and Sedition Act is a great case study of a president abusing his power to go after personal enemies. Now, this never went to court because in the political rematch that occurred in 1800, Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams. And one of the first things that Jefferson did when he became president was he got the new Congress, which was a Democratic-Republican Congress. He got them to pass legislation to repeal the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. Jefferson then pardoned all of the newspapermen who had been convicted, and he returned their fines with interest. So in this particular case, the issue did go away. Now, what's intriguing is that many years later in 1964, Justice Douglas, in an interview, said that if this case reached our court, we would unanimously strike down the Alien and Sedition Act. We would declare it unconstitutional. It clearly violates the First Amendment. My response to Justice Douglas is it's pretty easy in 1964 to say what you would do with a 1798 law. I'm not so sure that would have happened in 1798. First of all, no act of Congress had ever been struck down in 1798. And second, and most importantly, in 1798, we had a situation where all of the justices on the Supreme Court were of the same political party as John Adams. So would these individuals have voted against their president? There's no way to know that. The second case study, and probably the last one that I will get to in this lecture, is a very famous case, Schenck versus the United States. You can follow along in your written notes. Charles Schenck is a socialist. He distributes 15,000 leaflets comparing military conscription, that would be the draft, to slavery. And I think there's a mistake on the notes. It says comparing military conscription to the draft. Please correct your notes. Comparing military conscription to slavery, and urged readers to assert their rights. Schenck was arrested for violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918. And in this case, you get a very famous allegory that I've heard many, many times. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, quote, "Even the most stringent protector of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, causing a panic. Certain forms of speech are not merely advocacy, they are incitement, and thus are not protected by the First Amendment." Now, this next sentence is really important because when we get to the next case in the next lecture, we are going to discover that this becomes part of the defense in this case. But during normal times, these leaflets would be protected. However, during a wartime emergency, they constitute a clear and present danger that government and society have a right to suppress. So, in other words, in this particular case, there is a wartime emergency. Mr. Schenck is arrested in 1917. The First World War is going on. And because of that, the government has greater power and greater leeway. In this particular case, Justice Holmes used this new test called the clear and present danger test. And that's what I want you to know about Schenck versus the U.S. You may put down in your notes clear and present danger test. I like this test. With clear and present danger, the burden is on the government. Now, Justice Holmes makes the claim that government has met this burden because we have a wartime emergency. I like the test. I believe that it gives a wide latitude for free speech. In this particular case, though, I disagree with Justice Holmes, even though this guy is 10 times smarter than me. But when I read through this case and was in constitutional law, I was with, I liked the test, but I said that I didn't think that these leaflets comparing military conscription to the draft constituted a clear and present danger to anything. It didn't, he says assert your rights in these leaflets, and that could mean a lot of things. Certainly, you could, and I'll give Justice Douglas some due here, certainly it could constitute illegal activity. But to me, asserting your rights is vague enough to where it could be, okay, if you are a conscientious objector, talk to your clergyman. If you have medical infirmities, go see your doctor. And even if you don't buy that line of argument, to me, this notion of asserting your rights is very, very vague and is not a direct incitement to action. So in the case of Schenck versus the U.S., it is a landmark case. The clear and present danger test, which is a test that is commonly used in speech tests, is still employed today. So that is the most significant part of the case. To me, however, I do not believe that Mr. Schenck should have gone to prison. Now, in the next video lecture, I'm going to talk about the cases of Gitlow versus New York and Brandenburg versus Ohio, and you will see how this standard shifts and changes dramatically.